Okay, I'm sorry. I am Dr. Noni Davis, and I am here coming from St. Sya Academy, a private African Center school. I am a legacy owner. I give thanks to my late father, William Edward Davis, and my mother, who is still with us, Sylvia Davis, for uh, founding this institution, which has been serving the African American community since 1996 for 28 years. Last week during my broadcast, I started engaged in a conversation about Fort Mose and St. Augustine, which were Spanish colonies that were founded in what we call now the United States, but in Florida or Florida, as they would say, during the 1500s. First, it was St. Augustine. The Catholic Church sanctioned the beginning of this colony. It was uh, began with about 800 Spaniards, and about 50 Africans were there. Some were enslaved, some were not. Um, but it was during the 1500s. By 1570, the uh, colony had expanded, but there was a thriving African community, both enslaved and free, in this space. At some point, it was separated, and I believe Fort Mose, well, St. Augustine became the first free African town in what we now call the United States in 1570, something like that. And so my question was last week, well, what was the relationship between Africa and what we now call Spain, and who were the Moors? And how did the Moors influence Spain, and how did that maybe impact their relationship that they had with Africans? We know that in the colonies, like in the Caribbean and in Mexico, their interaction with the indigenous people there was not that positive. I think the Spanish only have one. I think Equatorial Guinea and maybe one other uh, space where they colonized in Africa. But most of it was in the Caribbean and in um, Florida, Texas, Mexico, what we call Mexico, New Mexico, Arizona, California. It was mostly the southern part of the United States. Um, and in those places, even if they had enslaved people, they did not seem to have um, it didn't seem to be as harsh as the British in this part of the world. I mean, I don't know. All of it is bad. Enslavement is bad, no matter what it is. But anyway, um, the Africans were both enslaved and free in those communities. So Fort Mose became a destination for escaped Africans in the 1600s, as the British expanded their colonies to the Carolinas, and I talked a little bit about that. And then there is a connection between Denmark Vesey's slave rebellion, and Fort Mose, which ultimately led to a war between the British and the Spanish, and the Africans at Fort Mose were forced to abandon that fort and move to Cuba, um, for their to maintain their freedom and not be captured by the British. So with that, I wanted to discuss what was Spain's relationship with Africa prior to New World exploration. So number one, who were the Moors? And most of us have heard about the Moors. We've heard about the Black Moors. We've heard about Moors being associated with Islam, um, and I did some research. I visited a, let's see, black a video by a young man where the Moors who invaded Spain black from nothing is the name of the video, the YouTube channel. I also visited Hawks Hawks Bay Today, which was a talking point. No comparison between white and black slavery, which is one of the topics I'm going to talk about. And then I also visited Ohio State News 2004 with an article from Jeff Grab Mercer. So I try to do a little bit of research broad so I can get a better understanding of what the Moors were. So basically, there's a consensus that the Moors were Middle Eastern and African people who practiced Islam. The Moors invaded, I think it was Tariq ibn Zayed in 711, invaded what we call Spain and Portugal now. During this time, it was called Al Andalus, which is not what, that's the first time I had heard of that name. Al Andalus was the name of this area. And so the Moors invaded from 711 CE to 1492. These This guy, Tariq ibn Zayed, was a Berber. And as we know, Berbers can range in complexion from African to white, because there's a lot of mixed race, uh, racial integration in that group, marriage, miscegenation, whatever you want to call it. And so they probably would look like African Americans if you were to take a scale of African Americans from um, able to pass for white versus to the darkest skinned Africans that we have. There's this under misunderstanding, or just this term that continued, I mean, this mind frame that continuously bothers me, because there's this disconnect, as always, from sub-Saharan African, as if everybody who is sub-Saharan African looks different from people who were in ancient Egypt, from people who were in Liberia. And today I heard, well, it's because of the Sahara Desert, and they were separated from Africans. And of course, we know people who lived on coastal areas were always interacting with different cultures, so that would make sense that you would have people who would look differently on the coastal areas, where you have a lot of interaction because of trade and economic um, movement, whatever. uh, that makes sense. But this desire to continuously disregard or disconnect from sub-Saharan Africa just blows my mind. I just, whatever. Y'all can say what you want to, but we can all see with our own eyes. We know what we're looking at. So, Africans and Middle Eastern soldiers who practiced Islam were what they would call Moors. All of the accounts from that period, the drawings, the eyewitness testimony, show that these were considered dark skinned, to where they would say that this is a literal translation, pitch black people. They were, so there was a range, but they were all considered dark brown. And of course, we know that Europeans were extremely fair, so anybody brown was going to look dark to them. But they did specify that there was range. um some of the conquerors, especially, I think they said there were 10 out the Almoravid Empire, which was mostly Berber, in 1076, joined with a group of people called the, what do they call themselves? The Takrur. The Takrur people were lived along the Senegal River, and near the Soninke people who were Ghana. So they were not part of the Ghanaian Empire. They were probably grafted in much later, when the empire expanded to Mali. But in 1076, they or 1086, they were still a separate empire from the Ghanaian Empire, the Empire of Ghana, which was part of the Ghana Mali Songhai um, Empire area. And so they joined with the Almoravid Empire, and in 1076, and they were one of the later groups of people who invaded Gibraltar and took Al Andalus, Spain, Portugal, took over that area. And so, and I did want to say the Takura people, that empire was from 500 to 1456. And so they were, must have been one of the empires that were grafted in to the, like I said, the Mali Songhai Empire. Um, did the Moors enslave the Spanish, or what we call the people who lived in um, Al Adalis? That was my question, because last week I wanted to say, okay, so what did Africans and Arab people do when they went into Europe, and what did that colonialism look like? So apparently, before the Muslims got there, there was already a slave trade in Europe. And this slave trade started with the Vikings. There were transports all the way up through France and down through the Rome, down through to Rome. The Romans also had started this slave trade. So before the Muslims even landed in Europe, there was already a slave trade. And I think between, let's see, the slave trade there lasted from about 250 years. So from the 15th century to the 19th century. Now, this is after, because the 14th century, I mean, the 15th century was when let's see, the Moors ruled from 711 CE to 1492. So the slave trade of Europeans began, where it was really bad, was from the 15th to the 19th century. Um, so the Moors were involved. They did do some slave trading, and they were mostly taking women and putting them, joining European women to their harems. There was a slave trade. It was not just Christians. It wasn't just whites. There were also non-white people who were involved in that slave trade. I think it said that people were taken from is as old as Rome. Let's see. European slaves were traded in the Muslim world, particularly women, as part of Muslim harems. They called it Sakaliba. I think that's the way to say it. But these were Slavs who were taken from Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, and Central Europe. So Central, Southern, and Eastern Europe. And so between 909 to 1171, most Europeans were enslaved as a result of conflicts or because of debts that their parents may have owned. They may have enslaved one of their children or something like that. But about 1.2 million were enslaved from the 15th century to the 19th century. And many, as a result, were the ones who were sold into Islam, or Islamic countries, became Muslim. So I guess that would be the people who are in Turkey, the people who are in Ukraine, the people who are in Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. All those people on that side and in Russia, who practice Islam. Um, Perhaps this is the legacy of that practice. Um, but what was the difference between African enslavement and European enslavement? Well, I just told you that their enslavement only lasted uh, uh, um, 250 years, from the 15th century to the 19th century. So that would be what, the 1400s to the 1800s. Um, it was mostly between Northern Africa and all of Europe. Um, they did not have, it was not racialized, and it was not religious based. So you were a Christian, you could be enslaved, but it wasn't only because you're a Christian, and it wasn't only because you're white. It was usually some legitimacy because of war. And I am not legitimizing, because enslavement, with no matter what it is, people losing their rights over themselves is a problem, no matter where it is. Um, it was not generational, so you did not have people who were enslaved uh, uh, by as an adult. Their children being forced to enslave it to enslavement. You could It probably affected your status in the community, that you were the descendant of a slave, but you were not uh, relegated to slavery, and you may have been poor, but it was not. You were not a slave, so you did have autonomy over your life, and you did have possibility of rising above, that particular status. Um, of course, the other thing is 1.2 million of Europeans, wherein above Africans in that same 300-year period, we had 12 to 20 million or more. This is what they speculate. Um, Over a 300-year period, which was the 15th to the 19th century as well, of enslavement. And so that's like 10 times, 10 to 20 times more people of African descent enslaved. And we had chattel slavery. So there were stark differences between how the European slavery was compared to African slavery. Both are bad, but Africans were far worse. It was far more abusive, and it was more massive, and people were people in both groups were forced out of their countries. Europeans were brought to North Africa and forced into slavery. Um, Africans were transported to, we don't even know how many Africans were taken to North America. Though 12 to 20 million is focused on just from the west coast of Africa to um, to the Americas, or what we call Americas today. So we really don't know. That's a whole nother number if we're going to include the enslavement of Africans um, the west coast to northern Africa, and into Europe. Um, so there's no comparison, and that was what the Hawks boy today, uh, Bay today, or something, Toady or something like that. I can't remember I don't know what I wrote there, but that was his clarification, that while there is no comparison between white and black slavery. Now, there was another guy who said slavery is slavery. I think this is the guy from the Ohio State News, was trying to say that, and his article is old, it's 2004, but still he was trying to say that, we still have to see that slavery is bad no matter what. I don't know about that. But anyway, so that's who were the Moors. What did they look like? How were they described amongst the people who saw them firsthand and drew pictures of them, and portrayed them in their literature? And then what was their what did they do? How did they influence, or how were people treated who were in those who were enslaved or conquered under this particular rule? Now I want to shift gears a bit and talk about what did the Moors bring to the Iberian Peninsula, because what we do know with the Spanish coming to and the Europeans coming to America, they did not bring much in the know-how of. They brought people over who were Africans were brought here because of the knowledge that they already had. The Moors took silk, rice, saffron, sugarcane, cotton, dates, lemons, oranges, peaches, and figs to Spain. But what did the Europeans bring to North America other than Africans and uh, weaponry to military, um, um, uh, well, yeah, the militia to Africa. We were forced when they brought over the sugarcane. We were forced to grow it. When they brought over rice, we were the ones that were forced to raise this stuff. Dates, lemons, oranges, everything that was brought to the States was brought here for the purpose of Africans toiling the earth and raising these crops and then harvesting these crops. So now, what else did the um, Europeans, I mean, did the African Moors and the Middle Eastern Moors take to Europe? They brought the astrolabe, astronomy, physics, chemistry, mathematics, geography, philosophy, according to Basil Davidson. Basil Davidson is an archaeologist who's I think he's deceased now, but he had so many um, documentaries on Africa. Basil Davidson, he's a good person to watch if you can find any of his videos. Um, they created modern cities, paved streets, raised sidewalks, well lit streets, and 900 public bathhouses in Cordova alone. All right, so what else did they do? Um, at this time, during this Muslim Moor occupation, there was a 99% illiteracy rate among Christian Europe, among the poor and the royals. So nobody could read and write for the most part. 99% of these people, and I think maybe only the people who are in the church could read and write, the priest and, their folks. But if you were not in the religious group, you could not read and write. Iberia, Spain was different. There was a universal education system in Iberia, Spain under the Moors. At this time, there were only two universities in Europe, but there were 17 in Moor Spain. They were at Cordova, Granada, Juan, um, Malaga, Seville, and Toledo. Between the 10th and 11th century, there were no public libraries in Europe. There were 70 in Moorish Spain. Arabic still influenced the Spanish language. Words with al, like algebra, alchemy, all of those words are Arabic words that were used, that are still part of the Spanish vocabulary, Spanish language. They introduced instruments in the 800s. They introduced instruments, the lute, the guitar, and the lyre. They introduced paper and Arabic numerals. Alhambia uh, was architecture. They introduced architecture. So they said prior to the Moorish invasion, large barns with no windows or chimneys uh, were what qualified as a medieval castle during that time. So this is where the royals lived in before Moors in other parts of the world, but not in the Moor Spain. The Moors expanded knowledge of the world trade to Europe and brought the compass from China. So is very interesting because we know that Timbuktu um, also had two major universities in 1100s, 1200s. You had several um, learning centers, and Mali, Timbuktu alone had two universities. And I did speak about how they had, it was the first educational outreach kind of program where they took that knowledge and traveled all over West Africa. We know that Africans were using um, the Arabic language to translate and write papers in their own language. And so Timbuktu was a major hub of knowledge. We know that our ancestors were, making, they had 8,000 years, I think, of smelting iron. We had Isibidi language, writing systems. The Mende have their own writing systems. We know the Ethiopians had their own writing systems. Um, the Yoruba had their own writing systems. And so there was not this extreme poverty. And when you go back and you look at the Mandan Charter, which I talked about before, and the Hunter's Oath, which I also discussed earlier, there was in the 1200s this. There was already a system of governing, and those documents are said to have been based on ancestral I'm sorry, knowledge to Jolly Musa, to Jolly Ba, or what we would call griot. Griot is a French word, but Jolly Musa, Jolly Bas are the African historians. The word for historians, or people who were uh, attached to or who served the royals. So it seems that when Africans, uh, the Middle Eastern, when Muslims and Africans converged upon Spain, they literally rose these people up out of darkness. Um, and educated them. And of course, they by 1492, the Moors were expelled, but the Portuguese and the Spanish had been engaged. Those were that is where the oldest universities in Europe are, and there's a significant difference between architecture in Spain and the architecture in the rest of Europe. Which and then you see that similarity in architecture also in, well, ours is a little different. If you look at Timbuktu and then Ethiopia, and in some of the northern African architecture. But to just know that there was not this destruction of the community, there was not this enchantment and just of the people, the denigration of the people, but uh, they elevated the community. And if there was only 1.2 million people who were enslaved, that means that a lot of these people were not bothered, and so they actually benefited from Islam. Wherein, conversely, Africa was raped of its people. It was the women were molested and raped and denigrated, and so there's just a big difference. And I want to continue to explore like um, the things, make some comparisons between medieval Africa and Europe. But anyway, it's just interesting to see how Europe was treated versus what Africa was treated after a conquering of people came. Anyway, Ashe.
I'm a St. Sya student. Of course, I walk into the sound of drums.
I'm a St. Sya student. Of course, I know my mother. Sya student. Of course I can play the drum.
I'm a St. Sya student. Of course I can work with my hands.
I'm a St. Sya student.
One day, we won't need this day. We won't need a day to celebrate how far we've come. We won't need a day to prove we're just as fast or strong or skilled. We won't need a day to relive the comebacks, the firsts, or the titles we've won. We won't need a day to rally behind the ones fighting to change the rules. One day, we won't need this day at all, because one day, this day, will be our everyday.